Welcome to part one of the Real Left Forum, Marxist-Humanist Initiatives Panels for the Council Conference 2020. I'm your chair for today, Eric Andrian. Who are we? Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and the further development of Marxist-Humanism as articulated by Raya Dinovskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses, whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization, in which mass movements striving for freedom take hold of Marxist philosophy of freedom and recreate society on a new basis. MHI believes that today's political, economic and environmental crises present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of providing theoretically that MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interest separate from theirs. Part one of our video panels is entitled The Poverty of Populism, a Marxist-Humanist critique of redistributionist politics. We will be discussing the persistence and current return by many on the left to the ideas of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and others that Marx was so critical of. Our three panelists will speak for up to 20 minutes each, followed by a brief period of comments and discussion. Panelists, I will let each of you know when your time is up. I am your chair, Eric Andrian, and our panelists today will be Andrew Kliman. Andrew Kliman is the author of Reclaiming Marx's Capital. You can get it on Lexington Books 2007, The Failure of Capitalist Production from Pluto Books 2012, and numerous articles in With Sober Senses, Marxist-Humanist Initiatives online publication. Brendan Cooney is our other panelist, reads Marx and writes about it on the internet. He has a blog, Capitalism 101, on WordPress. He is co-host of the podcast Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. David Matchett is a Colorado researcher interested in the implications of Marxist thought on understanding inequality and redistributive policies. So moving on, our first speaker will be Andrew Kliman, speaking on wealth inequality in the US, its level, trend and significance. Over to you, Andrew.
So what I'll be talking about is an article that I published in With Sober Senses, the MHI web journal, several months ago, Wealth Inequality in the US, its level, trend, and significance. So if you want more information, it's all there. Everybody is focused on the trend in wealth inequality or lack thereof. But what I want to do is focus more on what I think is the more crucial issue, which is the level of inequality of wealth. Just to get our terms clear, there's wealth, there's income. What's the relationship? Well, wealth is like a big pool of what you've got, and income is like a stream that goes in. You know, what's coming in right now, that's the income. It's right now. It's income, it's coming in, income. Okay, so that adds to the pool of wealth. Okay, so income is right now, wealth is your total accumulation. And for a very long time, focus on inequality in the US was all focused on income inequality rather than wealth inequality. And that's because the existing studies, which were based on survey data, where you go and ask people what they have, their assets, their liabilities, the survey data just didn't show any real significant trend in wealth inequality. So the red line, the purple line that you're seeing, that's what the studies were showing using the survey methodology. Okay, but then you began about 6 years ago to get a real focus on wealth inequality because of a very shocking study done by Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, which used an alternative approach, capitalization, and I'll explain that. And what they seem to have shown is a very sharp and continuing rise in the degree of wealth inequality. For instance, the share of total wealth held by the top 1% in the US throughout the whole period of neoliberalism from the end of the 1970s to the present. And once they came out with this study, the Social Democrats, left economic populists, took what they had to say and ran with it. For instance, Bernie Sanders got right on the board and he said, wealth and income inequality is worse today than any time since 1928. We are moving in exactly the wrong direction. The fact of the matter is that over the past 40 years, we've witnessed an enormous transfer of wealth. So notice how he's focused wholly on the trend. And that focus on the trend rather than the level, that has continued. Last year, Elizabeth Warren put out on her website the following: for decades, a small group of families has raked in a massive amount of the wealth American workers have produced, while America's middle class has been hollowed out. According to an analysis from Saez and Zuckman, the richest top 0.1% has seen its share of wealth nearly triple between the late 1970s and 2016, etc. Okay, so they're all focused on the trend rather than the level. And just going back, you see that irrespective, all of these studies are basically showing that the top 1% gets around 1/3 of all the wealth of the country. They hold about 1/3 of the wealth of the country, okay? Massive inequality of wealth, but they're focused on the trend. And I think that this has a lot of advantages for left economic populists and social democrats, but those are disadvantages from our perspective. By pointing to the trend or supposed trend instead of the level, the left economic populists put the blame on their political opponents, neoliberals, centrists, pro-establishment types. They don't put the blame on the pre-neoliberal consensus that countenanced a distribution of wealth that was massively lopsided well before it supposedly trended upward. And what they're doing is focusing on a secondary phenomenon, not the primary problem, which is the massive level of wealth inequality itself. And that will persist under capitalism, even after redistributive measures have done what they can do for reasons that I'll go into in a moment. But most importantly, I think, is by focusing on the trend, these folks are not implicating the capitalist system itself, even though the system itself is directly responsible for the lion's share of wealth inequality. And what do I mean by that? Well, capitalist relations of production, that is the split between owners of productive wealth or capital and proletarians, workers with little, if any, productive wealth of their own, that split persists year after year, generation after generation. What's that have to do with wealth inequality? Well, because the proletarians have very little wealth, if any, of their own, because of that, they're compelled to either starve or work for others and under the direction of others. Okay, and so this dynamic is responsible for both the continuing existence of capitalist relations of production, because without a proletariat that does the bidding of capital, there wouldn't be capitalism. Okay, and what enables there to be a continual supply of proletarians generation after generation, that's the massive degree of wealth inequality. Okay, so when I speak about productive wealth and the proletariat having very little, let me get more precise about that. You know, the way the statistics are done, all kinds of stuff is counted as wealth. The homes that people live in, the cars they drive, and other durable goods like refrigerators, and some savings for retirement, pension funds, bank deposits. Okay, but that's not productive wealth. It's not wealth that generates wealth. It's not capital. The capital is stocks, bonds, direct ownership of businesses, the green stuff. And you see that in the US, in the bottom half of the population, very little of the supposed wealth of the bottom 50% of the population consists of this productive wealth, stocks, bonds, businesses. And in the next 40% up, the situation is not much different. Okay, you get large shares of productive wealth as a share of their total wealth, really in the top 1%, and to some degree in the next 9% as well. Okay, so if we just look at this productive wealth, the business, stock, and bond assets, and how they're distributed for as long as there are data, the past 30 years, what we see is that the bottom half of the population has had 1% of this productive wealth. 50% of the people, 1% of that. And the next 40% of the population has had about 15% of this productive wealth. So together that's about 1/6. 90% of the population, 1/6 of the productive wealth, whereas the top 1% all along has been holding about a half of this business, stock, and bond wealth. The business, stock, and bond assets of the bottom 90%, they've increased even when we take account of inflation. Over the past 30 years, they've about doubled. But take a look at the size. As of last year, the average bond, stock, bond assets of the bottom 90% was $53,000 per household. That is far less than 1 year's income for a median household. So what these numbers are telling us is that 90% of the population is not able to accumulate even enough wealth that would tide it over a year. So it certainly does not have anywhere near the amount of wealth that would be needed. They can't save up enough to escape having to work for others under their direction and under compulsion. Okay, and that's what keeps capitalism going more than anything. Okay, one further thing I want to say, though, about why we should be not focused so much on trends in wealth, but the level of wealth inequality is there's this misleading idea that if there's an increase in wealth inequality, that means that wealth is being transferred upward. That some of the wealth that was held at the bottom or outside the 1%, that's being wrested away by the top 1%. And for instance, in the speech Bernie Sanders gave that I mentioned before, he said, "We have witnessed an enormous transfer of wealth from the middle class and working families upward." Well, there hasn't been a transfer. The median net worth, the wealth of the middle household, basically went up from about 60,000 to 140,000 from 1962 to 2007. So it's not that even if there is a rise in income inequality, it's not that the poor are becoming poorer. It's just that the rich are becoming richer at a faster pace than the poor are increasing their wealth. The rich are getting a bigger share, but it does not mean that the amount of wealth at the bottom is declining. It is not, or it was not through the Great Recession, till the start of the Great Recession, and it's rebounded since then. Okay, but let's talk about the trend that the social democrats and economic populists focus on. Who is right about the trend? The people who look at the survey data, where you go into households and ask people, what are your assets, various kinds, what are your liabilities, or the capitalization data relied on by Sias and Zuckman. Sias and Zuckman say that the survey of consumer finances, which is where everybody else is basically getting their data, it doesn't adequately measure the wealth of the super rich. And that's because very, very few super rich people agree to respond to the survey. And by design, for confidentiality purposes, the survey excludes almost all of the various wealthy people, the Forbes 400. However, the survey deals with the under-response by the super rich by including a disproportionate share of them so that it gets an adequate number of responses from them. And people have studied the issue, and there's just very little evidence to suggest that the super rich people who do respond to the survey are unrepresentative of the group. It seems that they are representative. In contrast to this, there's a lot of good reasons to be skeptical of Sias and Zuckman's estimates, which are based on tax returns. Basically, what they do is they look at income statistics and try to infer from the one-year income statistics what the capital assets underlying that generated that income are. That's called capitalization. And they use tax return data, and they're problematic for a number of reasons. One is that the tax return data are not data on people, they're not data on households, families, they're data on so-called tax units. And a married couple is one tax unit. An unmarried couple, whether they live together or not, they're two tax units. So how many people are in a tax unit? Well, it's a variable size. And there's been a very marked decline in the marriage rate among the 99%, but not at the top. Okay, so that means that there's been a proliferation of tax units outside of the top 1%. And that dilutes the growth of their wealth, okay? And that makes the rise in inequality seem even bigger. They seem to be getting wealthier less rapidly than they actually are when you look at tax units. Another huge issue is that when you look at the income on tax returns, it's not measuring the same thing consistently throughout time because of changes in tax law. One of the major things that took place was in 1986, there was the Tax Reform Act, and that created an incentive to report income on individual tax returns instead of corporate tax returns if you were a business owner. So this is
15 minutes.
Okay, great. So this is what we see is that as of 1986, Sias and Zuckman, are saying that the top 1% have 25% of all the income. 2 years later, 1988, it's jumped up to 28%. And that is not because they experienced a huge rise in their income. It's just because through 1986, the top rate on individual income was higher than the top corporate rate. The Tax Reform Act reversed that, and you just get a lot of people that had reported income as corporate income, which is not counted by Sias and Zuckman because they're looking at individual income. All of a sudden now they're reporting that as individual income, and it appears on their tax returns, and they seem to be wealthier, or at least richer in terms of income all of a sudden. Okay, one of the big problems with the Sias and Zuckman study is this capitalization issue, the estimation of wealth from capital income using rates of return on the wealth. One issue is that the super rich people have an incentive to report a lot of their labor income as capital income because it's taxed at a lower rate. But more fundamentally, these estimates of the rates of return that people are getting on their wealth are often just guesstimates or clearly wrong. For instance, Sias and Zuckman assume that all fixed income assets generate the same rate of return, whether you're talking about checking deposits, which generally earn 0 rate of return, or bonds, many of which are, high yield. They also assume, in effect, that all owners of a certain kind of asset obtain the same rate of return on the asset. It's clearly wrong. Super rich investors are often super rich because they have gotten extraordinarily high rates of return on their investment rather than average rates of return, such as the owners of Google, Microsoft, Apple, and so forth. And when you're underestimating the 1% rates of return that they've gotten, or overestimating the rates of return of the 99%, that makes the rise in inequality seem bigger than it is. And just another issue that leads to skepticism concerning Sias and Zuckman's results is they may well be undervaluing owner-occupied homes, the so-called wealth of those homes, and that would disproportionately reduce the 99%'s measured wealth because that's, as we saw, a lot of the wealth of the people at the bottom, so-called wealth, consists of just the homes they live in. So that would make the rise in inequality seem bigger if they were undervaluing that, and they certainly value it less than the survey results do. Okay, but I can't draw a definitive conclusion about the trend. The debate over the trend is still taking place, and to adequately deal with the issues, frankly, you need very specialized expertise, knowledge of details of the tax code, official statistics. You have to have a lot of time to pore over details of very big data sets. But one thing is clear, precisely because the debate is ongoing and still unresolved. It's intellectually irresponsible for researchers to treat their studies on the trend in wealth inequality as having established uncontested facts. It's just not the case, but that's the way that Sias and Zuckman do present their studies. And it's intellectually irresponsible for politicians, journalists, and commentators to follow them down that road. It may serve well as post-truthy populism, but in this era of Trumpism, post-truthy populism itself is one of the main threats we face. Wojciech Kopchuk, who used to be a co-author with Sias, made a comment last year that I fully agree with respect to this. He said that the Sias-Zuckman wealth estimates are highly uncertain numbers that should be presented together with some explicit notion of the magnitude of the measurement error, which they don't do. All sources of information point to an increase in wealth inequality. Exactly how much is very uncertain and should not be presented as certain. Although they do it, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders do it, and so forth. So, in conclusion, what's happened to wealth inequality? Has it risen sharply? Has it risen modestly? Has it not risen at all? Whatever. Several facts about the level of wealth inequality are quite clear. It's massive. Its main source is capitalism itself, the separation of working people from productive resources of their own, okay? And the perpetuation of the capitalist system requires that the inequality of wealth remain massive, because you need a proletariat without property that is compelled because of that to work for others. Okay, but that's not reason for despair, because the perpetuation of capitalism itself is not a given. Another world is possible. The struggle continues.
Thank you. And that was Andrew Kliman speaking on wealth inequality in the US, its level, trend, and significance. Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Brendan Cooney, and he will be speaking on Marx, Proudhonism, and Redistributionism. Over to you, Brendan.
Okay. This paper discusses the extent to which Marx's critique of Proudhonism can inform a critique of contemporary modern-day redistributionist politics. I'm going to survey some arguments that Marx deployed against Proudhon and explore the notion that Proudhonism itself was a form of redistributionist politics. But first, what do I mean by redistributionist politics in this paper? Marx referred to distribution relations as the distribution of the new value added by the annual newly added labor into the wages of worker, the profits of capital, and the rent accrued by owners of land. And Marx contends that the so-called distribution relations then correspond to and arise from the historically determined specific social forms of the process of production. In other words, each mode of production begets its own unique mode of distribution, and only in the capitalist mode of production does distribution consist of wages, profit, and rent. And Marx continues saying, the view which regards only distribution relations as historical, but not production relations, is on the one hand solely the initial, still handicapped criticism of bourgeois economy. On the other hand, it rests on the confusion and identification of the process of social reproduction with the simple labor process. In other words, what Marx is saying here is that those who critique capitalist distribution without critiquing capitalist production are guilty of treating capital abstractly as an eternal phenomenon. As Marx argues in many places, even if these sorts of politics may sound appealing in their condemnation of the injustices of capitalist distribution relations, they are essentially apologetic and reactionary, trapped in the paradox in which they, quote, they are merely an attack on consequences whose causes remain unaffected. So that's what I mean by redistributionist politics here. Politics which rail against the iniquities of capitalist distribution relations, ignoring the fact that these relations are the historic form of distribution which necessarily accompanies capitalist production. Therefore, no matter how clearly reformists may devise projects, tricks, and reforms to change the distribution of value between wages, profit, and rent, they fail to change anything fundamental about this distribution. In Marx's time, one of the major currents of redistributionist thinking, which drew Marx's continual ire, was that of the French socialist Proudhon. Proudhon imagined that the law of value was not able to operate fairly because of the distorting aspects of money. If products could directly trade for one another, without the distortion of money, then a producer, Proudhon thought, could receive the full fruits of their labor. Proudhon also later became interested in the critique of interest-bearing capital, claiming that usury was a parasitic imposition on industry, and Proudhon joined in the call for what they called free credit at the time, and a French People's Bank. In both Proudhon's critique of money and in his later critique of credit, his focus was always on the sphere of circulation, the distribution of value between wages, profits, and rent, but never on the actual question of how capitalist production is organized. This was the era of free credit as a popular slogan of Proudhonian socialism. It was the era of the French Credit Mobilier Bank, which promised to mobilize public resources for public infrastructure projects and jumpstart French industry, inspired by the socialist utopianism of Saint-Simon. So Marx wasn't just addressing abstract thought experiments like, what if we got rid of money, but real political demands, albeit utopian, to transform society through socialist public banking and free credit, all within the context of one of the first modern capitalist nation states, Bonaparte's France. So within this context, the political parallels, I think, between Proudhonian politics and contemporary redistributionism are more obvious. In both Marx's time and ours, the power of a capitalist state to mobilize resources in socially beneficial ways, to redistribute resources for public benefit, and to dampen class struggle, which aims at uprooting capitalist production by mesmerizing masses of people with promises of free stuff and of the capacity of utopian tinkerers to level the playing field so that all can share equally in the fruits of capitalist production. In both Marx's time and ours, this ideological struggle is quite similar, at least in these broad senses. So in the paper, I go into a lot of aspects of Marx's critique of Proudhon that I think are relevant today. And this is a shorter version of the paper. I can't go into all of them now, but let's look at some of them. First, some more general points. The first thing that is to be said, I think, of Marx's critique of Proudhon is that this was not just an aside. It's not like Marx had a critique of capitalism and then he also had this political critique of Proudhon, because sometimes the Marx-Proudhon debate is cast as just like a political issue of how do you capture state power or something. And there's almost nothing in Marx's critique of Proudhon that has anything to do with politics. It's all about these issues of distribution and society. One of the most challenging aspects of reading through Marx's critique of Proudhon is the fact that Proudhon's thinking is often incoherent and full of lots of amateurish mistakes and sort of poor philosophical conceptions. And the reader perhaps sympathizes with Marx, recalling that in our time as well, we're often confronted with opponents whose thinking is so muddled that we can easily get lost in the weeds and lose focus on the main idea. That's why I found a particular moment from the beginning of the Grundrisse where Marx is sort of getting lost in the weeds a little bit in his critique of one of Proudhon's disciples, Derrida. But he finds a way to cut to the chase, and he has a passage that I'll quote in full. He says, "We have here reached the fundamental question, which is no longer related to the point of departure. The general question would be, can the existing relations of production and the relations of distribution which correspond to them be revolutionized by a change in the instrument of circulation and the organization of circulation? Further question, can such a transformation of circulation be undertaken without touching the existing relations of production and the social relations which rest upon them? If every such transformation of circulation presupposes changes in the other conditions of production and social upheavals, there would naturally follow from this the collapse of the doctrine which proposes tricks of circulation as a way of, on the one hand, avoiding the violent character of these social changes, and on the other hand, of making these changes appear to be not a presupposition, but a gradual result of the transformations in circulation. An error in this fundamental premise would suffice to prove that a similar misunderstanding has occurred in relation to the interconnections between the relations of production, of distribution, and circulation." Now, of course, neither Derrida nor Proudhon ever poses the question this way. Nevertheless, Marx is able to get to the real theoretical issues at stake and pose them in a way that really highlights what is ultimately at stake in the Proudhonist project hatching. Proudhonism, according to Marx, was really about this false promise that one can revolutionize society by tinkering with circulation and distribution, avoiding more fundamental issues of the mode of production. So I'd like to go into lots of details, lots of these examples, but let's just look at a couple places where Marx is critiquing aspects of Proudhonian redistributionism and how they might be useful today. One of Proudhon's chief economic complaints is that producers do not receive the full value of their labor because the distorting aspects of money. Ideally, for Proudhon, commodities would trade at a value equal to the labor time expended on their production, but in practice, the privileged position of money, as he calls it, introduces a distorting effect on exchange, which causes commodities to trade at prices other than their ideal values. Thus, for Proudhon, the determination of value by labor time is an ideal to be achieved in order to be freed from the evils of money. Obviously, this is the standpoint of the petty bourgeois owner-producer, not like a wage laborer or an industrial firm. And note that the distortions Proudhon complains of are distortions of distribution. They have to do with how value is distributed between producers after production has taken place. Marx goes into great details to explain to the reader that rather than an unachieved ideal, the determination of value by labor time is the present reality for capitalist society already. Even more important, he uses this opportunity to explain that commodities already have a value and a price in production prior to exchange. Further, the money form of this value is already inherent in the commodity form itself, rather than some expendable feature that can be cast aside. In fact, Marx warns that tricks of the circulation artists, as he calls them, to invent clever schemes to do away with money are doomed to failure because money is just an extension of the indirect sociality of labor and the need to present social averages in a general form. There's a lot more we could say about this point, but time is ticking. In our days as well, we are confronted with a current of thought which seeks to suspend the complications and contradictions which arise for the existence of money alongside the particular commodities merely by altering the form of money. That was a Marx quote. I should have quoted that. And this theory is called modern monetary theory, or MMT. And despite brutal critiques from many corners of economic thought, MMT has continued to play a role in modern redistributionist politics. Why? because modern redistributionism relies on the promised miracles of state spending, and MMT promises an escape from the inherent constraints imposed on state spending by capitalist production and the money form itself. With MMT, state money freed from the privileges of metallic money has magic powers to suspend the complications and contradictions of money in a capitalist society. And I think here, there are a lot of critiques of MMT which exist sort of in the details of MMT's various branches of arguments. But I think what we can get from Marx is the importance of going straight to the fundamental questions which are at stake. And asking, just like he asked Proudhon and Derrida toward the beginning of the Grundrisse, we have here reached the fundamental question, which is no longer related to the point of departure. The general question would be this: can the existing relations of production and the relations of distribution which correspond to them be revolutionized by change in the instrument of circulation? Maybe we can go into that in more detail in discussion. Another parallel with Proudhonism and contemporary redistributionism is Proudhon's claim that workers cannot buy back the full value of their own product because of a surcharge added by banking capital onto the real value of the product. That's, in other words, because of interest. If you've read Capital, then you know what to do with this sort of claim. You point out that if all capitalists added a surcharge, it would be the same as if none had, and that only if some do, then value is just being transferred in exchange. But more importantly, you would explain the difference between labor power and the value produced by labor power, and how this explains the creation of surplus value. Marx remarks that this misunderstanding was the basis for Proudhon's theory of overproduction. That is, if workers can't buy back the full value of their products, then that results in a tendency to overproduction, which leads to crisis. Those familiar with the later volumes of Capital would know how to respond to this as well. Here in the Grundrisse, in the space of 15 pages, Marx goes on to develop complex arguments that will span much of volume 2 and 3 of Capital. Workers' consumption is not the only source of demand. Another source is investment demand, the investment by capital and means of production. So there was no inherent reason why a shortfall in consumer demand should cause an economic crisis by itself. And here again, parallels with contemporary redistributionist thought is strong. Modern redistributionism is highly saturated with the anti-neoliberal sentiment that suggests that the Great Recession was the result of bad neoliberal governance, which caused wages to fall while profits and CEO salaries rose, resulting in a crisis of underconsumption. That is, capitalist crisis is theorized as being caused by an unequal distribution of wages and profits. The same arguments Marx sketches out to rebut Proudhon's overproduction theory are equally valid in rebutting the underconsumptionist theories of contemporary redistributionists. A shortage of consumer demand can and will be compensated by a rise in investment demand. Rather than explaining crisis through the distribution between capital and labor, Marx identifies the essential crisis tendencies of capitalism in capitalist production itself and the domination of living labor by dead labor in the form of constant capital. And he identifies the long-run tendency for falling rates of profit. The last parallel that I'll throw out there today is the difference between project hatching and Marx's look at real movements for thinking about theory and social change. The poverty philosophy, Marx's first critique of Proudhon, ends with Marx's discussion of Proudhon's opposition to strikes. It's a fitting way of closing the book, as it nicely dramatizes not only what is at stake politically and the differences between the two, but also different understandings of the historical subject and how this produces widely different modes of thought. Proudhon's main reason for opposing organized labor was that it would artificially raise wages, which would in turn raise prices, leading to economic disruptions. Again, those who are familiar with Marx can anticipate his response, that a rise in wages does not alter the value of a commodity, only the distribution between wages and profit. But then Marx turns to empirical reality to contrast the sort of utopian project hatching of the socialists with the real empirical movement of workers, the strikes, combinations, and other forms of that proletarians carry out before our eyes, their organization as a class, as he says. Here Marx makes it clear that his theoretical vantage point is inseparable from this revolutionary subject, the subject which, in its struggle for freedom, is the only possible force for the transformation of society. And he says, quote, an oppressed class is the vital condition for every society founded on the antagonism of classes. The emancipation of the oppressed class thus implies necessarily the creation of a new society. For the oppressed class to be able to emancipate itself, it is necessary that the productive powers already acquired and the existing social relations should no longer be capable of existing side by side. Of all the instruments of production, the greatest productive power is the revolutionary class itself, end quote. This could not be different than the position of Proudhon, who sought to belittle, dampen, and suppress the movements of workers instead of elevating the marginalized. Instead, he sought to elevate the petty bourgeoisie. Without a basis in real movement happening before our eyes, as Marx said, one is forced to resort to project hatching, devising clever tricks to attempt to bypass this or that social ill, without ever looking honestly with sober senses at the real contradictions we face as a society. The difference in perspective has everything to do with the difference between redistributionist politics, which seek to tinker with the secondary aspects of capitalism, and Marxist politics, which seek to totally uproot society at its most fundamental relations. The parallel with contemporary left populism is striking. Today we have the pairing of fiery, sensational rhetoric aimed at the rich and powerful, accompanied by project hatching and unrealistic promises that tinker with distributional aspects of capitalism and leave the question of capitalist social relations untouched. The modern nostalgia for the New Deal, which is now portrayed as the radical promise of contemporary communism or socialism, forgets that the original New Deal was devised in part as a response to the threat of communism, as a way of suppressing the organized power of the working class with the benevolent capitalist state, and as a tool to maintaining racial hierarchy in America. The agency of the working class is replaced by the agency of these cleverer tinkerers who have a plan for that. And that's the end of my paper.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. That was Brendan Cooney speaking on Marxism, Proudhonism, and Redistributionism. Okay, thank you very much, Brendan. Our third and final panelist is David Matchett, and his topic will be on the limits of redistributive state action, Marx's analysis of the Silesian weavers' uprising. Over to you, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Introduction. From the point of his initial radicalization, Karl Marx chose to eschew redistributionism. He believed that a proletarian revolution must be a revolution against capitalism as such, not a mere reallocation of the proceeds of capitalist production. With his 1843 critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Karl Marx signaled a definitive break with bourgeois philosophy. In this work's introduction, Marx identifies the proletariat as being a quote-unquote class with radical chains who cannot emancipate itself without emancipating itself from all other spheres of society, and thereby emancipating all other spheres of society. From the start, he anticipates that the proletarian cannot realize their historical agency through mild reforms. Their role will be one of profound, discontinuous change, revolution. In the year following this profound shift in Marx's thinking, a revolt occurred which confirmed his earlier conclusions and deepened his understanding. This was the revolt of the Silesian weavers. Marx's former friend and co-editor, Arnold Ruge, anonymously published an article concerning the Silesian uprising. True to his moderate Republican politics, Ruge signals disapproval at the workers and advises the King of Prussia to prevent further uprisings by easing the poverty of the workers. In the German periodical Vorwärts, Marx publishes an article, critical marginal notes on the article by a Prussian, and savagely critiques Ruge's thin argumentation. He emphasizes the radical consciousness evinced by the weavers during the uprising and asserts that Ruge's plea to the King of Prussia is in fact impossible to fulfill. Citing numerous historical examples, Marx asserts that attempts to alleviate the workers' poverty necessarily fall short of their goals. The Uprising. Silesia is a region between Germany to the west and Poland to the east. In the 1840s, it was part of the Kingdom of Prussia. In the first decades of the 19th century, the traditional Silesian craft of linen weaving was devastated by competition from the British textile industry. Already, the English industry benefited from the use of machines that vastly increased the quantity of textiles that workers could produce, undercutting prices across the continent. The condition of the Silesian weavers were depressed to the point of bare subsistence. Furthermore, they were increasingly forced to abandon artisanal industry, instead being employed in factories founded by members of the nascent German bourgeoisie. On the 3rd of June, 1844, weavers in Peterswaldau gathered outside the house of a noted manufacturer, Zwanziger, and sang a song, Das Blutgericht, or the Blood Court, telling of their misery at the hands of the capitalists. After a confrontation with the police, the workers broke through the door and set to destroying the house. Afterwards, they moved on to Zwanziger's factory, where they destroyed the machines. These actions so far resembled the protest movements of English workers, who since the late 18th century had channeled their desperation into the destruction of the machines that oppressed them. But the Silesians went further. They also destroyed Zwanziger's ledgers, in so doing attacking the invisible enemy of finance aristocracy, as well as the visible enemy of the industrialist. They are reported to have found some 1,000 pounds in the offices. Instead of using the cash to soften their dire poverty, they cast it into the street. Their revolt was not aimed to enrich themselves, but rather against the very structure of capitalism in which they were bound. A contingent of soldiers was summoned to suppress the revolt. After a number of skirmishes that left at least 11 weavers dead, the uprising was finally extinguished, but its memory testified to the explosive power of workers' self-activity. Ruga's article and Marx's critique. Arnold Ruga recognized the seriousness of the weavers' plight and chides Prussia for ignoring them. He says, "Good words and a good frame of mind are cheap, insight and successful deeds are dear. In the present case, they are more than dear, they are still not at all to be had." Finally, he calls upon the King of Prussia to at once issue a decree for the education of all uncared-for children. Ruga recognizes the desperation of the weavers, but he believes that it should be eased by welfare provided by the state. In contrast to Ruga, Marx emphasizes the agency of the weavers. He asserts that their actions reveal a consciousness beyond that of their supposedly more advanced brethren in France and England. He further notes that Ruga's analysis is empty of an understanding of the class nature of the state. The primary function of the state is to manage class antagonisms. To abolish class antagonisms would be to abolish the state itself. Thus, the state will alleviate poverty only in a superficial manner. Marx says, "The state is based on the contradiction between public and private life, on the contradiction between general interests and private interests. Hence, the administration has to confine itself to a formal and negative activity, for where civil life and its labor begin, there the power of the administration ends." End quote. To put flesh to his theory, Marx analyzes historical attempts to end poverty by fiat. Historical examples. First, Marx examines England's policies on pauperism. Established in the late 1500s, the English Poor Laws were envisioned as a centralized, publicly administrated charity which functions by imposing a requirement that parishes must support their poor laborers. Despite the charitable architecture established by the Poor Laws, pauperism expanded in lockstep with the growth of British industrial capitalism. In response to the failure of the Poor Laws to eliminate poverty, Parliament in 1834 substantially restructured them. Inspired by Malthusian political economy, the new Poor Laws were designed along intentionally carceral lines. Relief was now administered in the form of workhouses that were intended to degrade the workers. As Marx says, finally, poverty came to be regarded as the fault of the poor themselves, and consequently, they were punished for it. Marx's second example is the example of Napoleon Bonaparte. After securing a continental empire, Napoleon attempted to further secure his legacy by abolishing mendicancy at a stroke. He directed his bureaucracy to implement a system for the abolition of French pauperism. Frustrated with the bureaucrats' dragging pace, Napoleon impatiently directed them to act immediately and forcefully. He said, "One ought not to traverse this earth without leaving behind traces which would earn us the grateful memory of posterity." In 1808, this directive led to the creation of the Dépôts de Mendicité. The Poor Laws Administration existed for centuries before taking on a carceral effect. The depots accomplished this transformation in a matter of months. According to Marx, they became converted into punitive institutions that very soon the poor entered them only by order of the police court. Marx's final example comes from a society that exhibits perhaps the greatest degree of political consciousness and energy in all of modern history up to that point. Following the French Revolution of 1792, the Convention released a decree to abolish pauperism. They then directed the Committee of Public Safety to draw up plans to accomplish the substance of this decree. As Marx concludes, what was the result of the Convention's decree? That one more decree came into the world, and 1 year later, starving women besieged the Convention. Where Napoleon had at least taken some concrete actions for the abolition of mendicancy, the Convention's good intentions withered on the vine without bearing any sort of fruit. What conclusions can we draw from these historical examples? There is no shortage of instances, either before 1844 or after, of societies that have declared a war on poverty through redistributive state policies. Sometimes these are outright political maneuvers, but in many cases they are, to all appearances, earnest attempts to alleviate misery. The unmitigated failure to achieve the abolition of poverty arises from the nature of the state itself. The wealth redistribution and administrative shuffling that the state is able to undertake are precisely those measures which fail to achieve the desired goals. As Marx concludes, but insofar as the states have occupied themselves with pauperism, they have either confined themselves to administrative and charitable measures, or they have retreated to less than administrative action and charity. Can the state act in any other way? The state, contrary to what the Prussian demands of his king, will never see in the state and the system of society the source of social maladies. Where political parties exist, each party sees the root of every evil in the fact that instead of itself, an opposing party stands at the helm of the state. Even radical and revolutionary politicians seek the root of the evil not in the essential nature of the state, but in a definite state form, which they wish to replace by a different state form. An end to pauperism will never be received as a gift from the state. Statists like Ruga believe that they can use public welfare to buy off the masses, who will obligingly reward them with votes. Marx's view could not be more different. Marx saw the masses not as a passive instrument of elite intention, but rather as the very motive force of revolution. A proletarian revolution will not be bestowed from above, but rather brought about by the self-activity of the masses. And that's the end of my paper.
Okay, thank you. That was our third and final panelist, David Matchett, speaking on the limits of redistributive state action, Marx's analysis of the Silesian weavers' uprising. If you're just joining us, welcome back to part 1 of the Real Left Forum, Marxist-Humanist Initiative's video panels for the cancelled conference 2020. We have just had 3 presentations by our panelists, Andrew Kliman, Brendan Cooney, and David Matchett, on the theme of the poverty of populism, a Marxist-Humanist critique of redistributionist politics. We are now going to have some brief discussion and comments on each of the papers, and we've got approximately 5 minutes for each paper. Okay, let's see. So first one, we've got Brendan. And you're commenting, have you got a comment or ask questions on Andrew's presentation on wealth equality?
Yeah, So when Andrew first came out with his research about trends and wealth inequality, uh, I was happy to see it because, for years we had been talking about this narrative about income inequality that we were hearing from a lot of the left in the around the time of the Great Recession, and questioning some of that narrative about income inequality over the course of the neoliberal era. And then at some point, that narrative sort of dropped out of the public discourse, and one started to hear all these claims about wealth inequality, and the dramatic increases in wealth inequality. Um, and I didn't know what to make with those. It seemed like a maybe related or maybe a completely different issue, and I wasn't sure if what that trend that was all about. So it was helpful when Andrew came out with this research and got some perspective on these claims. The real takeaways from Andrew's paper are things that he already stressed very well, but for one, the idea of focusing on a trend in wealth inequality really takes us away from the more important issue, which is that wealth inequality is always very extreme in a capitalist society. I mean, even looking at those graphs, even the Size and Zuckman graph, with its extreme version of the trend, is still within like a somewhat narrow band of movement compared to the actual top and bottom of where wealth inequality is at all times in a capitalist society. Even more striking for me was breaking down the heterogeneity of what we mean by wealth, and seeing that when we're talking about wealth, we're talking about so many different types of things that it's actually reducing them all to an abstract term like wealth is actually just that act by itself is somewhat can only take us so far. We're talking about comparing things like a house or a car that a working person owns to the sort of complicated financial instruments and other sort of financial assets that a very wealthy person owns. In some ways, it almost feels like apples and oranges. So being able to distinguish between those different types of wealth, I think, is also really helpful for me, and I think other people too, when they're trying to make sense of this. There's this intuition, I think, that
3 minutes.
Reformists. How much?
That was 3 minutes. You've got
Okay.
2 minutes.
There's a intuition that I think has to be challenged, that we hear so much from the sort of reformist and redistributionist parts of the left, and that's that every time they talk about capitalism, there's always an adjective in front of it. It's either neoliberal capitalism or crony capitalism or corporate capitalism. And those things always keep us from actually looking at capitalism itself. It's like a little shell game where every time we think that we're making a critique of capitalism, we're actually ended up critiquing something else. And what the current sort of social democratic aesthetic is to blame neoliberal politicians for everything that's wrong with capitalism and to focus on these minor trends and ignore all of the actual context of what social relations are like in a capitalist society. And it's quite similar to what Marx is doing with his critique of Proudhon, where he's saying, look, your camera's over here, and there's actually this much more complicated picture over here that needs to be talked about. Those are all my comments for now.
Okay, we have 30, say about a minute left. Does anybody want to add anything to this? You can if you want to. We've got like less than a minute left though. Okay, that's hearing nothing. That's the 5 minutes up. So thank you, Brendan, for commenting on Andrew's presentation on wealth inequality. David Matchett, you're next. Do you have any brief comments or questions on Brendan's paper, Marx, Proudhonism, and Redistributionism?
Yeah, so first off, I'd just like to thank Brendan for a very enlightening analysis of Marx's critique of Proudhon. I think that in our current age, historical memory, barely stretches back a generation or two, and it's very valuable and useful to look back not just 20 years or 50 years, but 150 years, and see how the exact same arguments which we're dealing with now have been sort of being paraded around throughout all that time. And I particularly appreciated your highlighting the similarities between Proudhonism and modern money theory, since that has become such a popular talking point among redistributionists, contemporary redistributionists. So one question I wanted to ask you was, Marx points out in The Poverty of Philosophy that really even at the time that Proudhon was writing, the arguments you were making was somewhat cliche. He lists, I don't know, a dozen or more writers who made essentially the same arguments that Proudhon has made. So why do you think that Proudhon was highlighted for such a sustained and serious critique by Marx rather than another redistributionist?
Should I answer that now?
Yes, go ahead,
Okay.
Dave.
Okay.
Go ahead, Brendan.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's anything too profound about it. I think that it was just that Proudhon was current and influential in French circles, and so as part of Marx's constant battle with the socialists of his time, he was someone to engage with. He was also, Proudhon was very provocative and attention grabbing. So I think there was my understanding was he was kind of in the ether and someone to be dealt with, while the sort of utopian socialists that Marx pointed out Proudhon's similarity with, they were sort of already sort of part of the historical past or historical memory. They weren't a current political force.
So a second question, as I mentioned in the introduction and as you highlighted multiple times in your paper, we keep hearing these same redistributionist arguments again and again through the decades, through the centuries. And, in some sense, the course of history has proven how insufficient they are. So why do you think that they're so durable? Why do you think we keep these arguments keep resurfacing?
I think that it's part of the nature of capitalist society that it's very easy to blame secondary aspects of capitalist society for more fundamental things. It took a lot of careful thinking on Marx's part to untangle this issue of sort of what are the more fundamental aspects of capitalist social relations and what are secondary or even tertiary, aspects. And those things aren't apparent immediately by looking at society. So that means that many other people can make the same mistakes that someone like Gray or Bray or Proudhon or Saint-Simon, all these different people who made the similar kind of mistakes, people today can make the same kind of mistakes. There's also there's a real incentive to pursue reforms in a capitalist society when changing the whole mode of production seems too overwhelming a task. So there's a real incentive for people to promote sort of reformist politics that seem like something you could actually put through Parliament or passed through Congress or something. So I think that's probably the reason.
Okay, we've got 1 minute left, Brendan. So I was just going to comment very briefly that an obvious form of redistributionist politics is this whole talk and discussion about universal basic income is a very, very big issue that's going on at the moment. And with the handouts that are going on, for example, in America, where I think it's people are getting $2,000 every month or every few months or something. In Britain, we have a scheme called furloughing, where the government, in both cases, the government is actually dipping into funds and paying workers money so that they aren't being made redundant. And I would just say that's a really good example of redistributionist politics that's going on. But because it's an economic crisis, the capitalists are forced, even the right-wing governments, like we have the Conservatives in the UK, and America has the Republican Party, and they've been forced to basically put their hand in their pocket and actually carry out redistributionism. You ever got any brief comments on that? You've got 30 seconds if you want.
Yeah, well, I would just say that I don't think that it's bad to redistribute income. And it's not bad to make demands for the redistribution of income. And sometimes it's quite crucial for just stabilizing the political situation in a country. For the capitalist class realizes it sometimes. But there are real limits to what those kind of politics can achieve. I think that's what we can glean from Marx, understanding what those limits are.
Eric, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brendan, for that. That was David was commenting on your paper, Marx, Proudhonism, and Redistributionism. The last paper that we're commenting on is the limits of David's paper, the limits of redistributive state action, Marx's analysis of the Silesian workers' uprising, and basically I'm the person who will be commenting on that. Okay, so David uses the historical event, the Silesian workers' uprising, to show how Marx, even then, could see the limits of state intervention in attempting to solve fundamental problems like poverty that plague modern society. He attacks Ruger and his ilk on this point. About the state's response to the poor, Marx says they have either confined themselves to administrative and charitable measures, or they have retreated to less than administrative action and charity, i.e. punitive measures. Even now, today, we can see the same kind of process that Marx outlined, and it's often a process that reformists that we've been talking about and people who are socialists go through. We can see this in the UK. The poor are first treated as people who find themselves in unfortunate circumstances, deserving of charity. So you get helping schemes like food kitchens, food banks, housing advice, charity sleep outs, and funded places to stay in winter and so forth. And then when the poor are found sleeping in doorways, drinking heavily, begging, or lying drugged up in the middle of the footpath, they become a social nuisance to be prevented and then locked up. With the COVID crisis, people are extremely happy that they and the government have helped many of the poor off the streets and into temporary accommodation. And so the cycle starts again. In his conclusion, David says, the state and the system of society will never see itself as the source of social maladies. Where political parties exist, each party sees the root of every evil in the fact that instead of itself, an opposing party stands at the helm of the state. Okay, and this is something that we're very familiar with in the UK again. A perfect example is the to-in and fro-in, as I call it, over who controls the state in the UK. This is a good example is the fighting by the main parties over the National Health Service. Before the 2019 general election, Boris Johnson's Conservatives were dismissing the expenditure plans of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party as completely unrealistic and not value for money. Since they won the election, the Conservatives won the election, and as a result of the COVID crisis, the Conservative government has spent billions more than Jeremy Corbyn even thought of. So much so that early on this year, as the crisis broke, Labour supporters were saying, "We told you so," and hailing the act of spending more on healthcare as socialism in practice. My question to you, David, is, to the reformists, it seems very natural to do what they do. Of course, you must take control of the state to alleviate social problems. That's how it's always been done. And it seems that their actions are ingrained over years, even hundreds of years of practice. How do you think we can begin to challenge that? We've got about 2 minutes to deal with that. So, David, do you want to come back?
Yeah. So I think the most important thing to make clear is that the reforms are not in any sense a rebellion against the capitalist system. I mean, that the state has always fulfilled this role of redistributing to try to smooth over the contradictions of the capitalist system, to suppress class conflict and avert revolution. And I think in our modern age, it can feel, if you're a Bernie Sanders supporter, supporting Medicare for all seems like a very radical demand if what you're used to is what is normally talked about. So it feels very radical. But in fact, its main function is to stabilize the capitalist system. And essentially, the notion of non-reformist reforms is exactly as contradictory as it sounds. And so you mentioned that seizing state power for the purpose of reforms is what has always been done. And I'd posit that that's exactly the problem. That's what's always been done, and we can see where it got us. It might be a cliche, but if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten. So to find a truly revolutionary politics, it's necessary to think past our history and embrace what Marx called new passions and new forces arising from proletarian struggle, not arising from, plan hatching from above.
Okay, thank you for that, David. We haven't really got time for any more further questions unless somebody's got something burning they want to ask.
Could I just make a couple of brief comments on the other two presentations?
Of course, or do you want, we've got time for final comments from panelists. Do you want to do that now?
I could do it as part of my final comments.
Okay.
However you wish.
Okay, right, so that's what we're going to do now. So we just have time for final comments, about 2 minutes each, if that should be enough time. And Andrew, you could start.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you, Brendan, for your comments on my presentation. Yeah, what happened is, I was heavily into this debate about, the income inequality, and then this distraction and diversion is coming right at that time from Sias and Zuckman. And it takes a good deal of time to work it all through. And, I really just was not going to go there. I really resented having to, continually be responding to them. This so-called, conversation, it's meant never to get down to the brass tacks and decide the issue once and for all. And we who are now accustomed to Trumpism know how that works. You create a diversion in Portland by kidnapping people on the street, so that your own mental health doesn't become the issue for very long. Okay, and this is basically what I think has been happening. We're in this shell game all the time. I think it's going to be coming to an end. The podcast episode that you and I did on the game-changing inequality database, whatever it is, I think within a couple of years, the shell game is coming to an end. So I just said, look, I'm not going to do this, and I didn't have time. So now I have the time. I went through and I looked, and I saw that there are a lot of real problems with the Piketty and the Sias and Zuckman stuff, and the Piketty Sias Zuckman stuff. I'm really glad that David and Brendan have been doing this work. As I understand it, it's beginning to really try to nail down what Marx had to say about redistributionism. And one reason I think it's so important is that there's an integrality.
30 seconds.
Yeah, there's an integrality of politics and theory here. Okay, so it's not just that the redistributionists are wrong theoretically. They're wrong politically and theoretically. Marx, putting it a different way, not only had some theoretical differences with them, he had politics that differed from their kind of elitist politics. And so on both sides, there's a whole, an economic, political whole, philosophical whole. And what we have to do, I think, is reclaim the entirety. Marx's philosophy, Marx's politics, Marx's, economic critique. And it's also, I think, a tremendous intellectual task. It's something we have to do so that people will want to engage in theory and not just to have everything be part of some marketing strategy for advantage. If everything is just marketing strategy for advantage, saying what you want to say because people like it, then left intellectual work, properly speaking, will have come to an end, and that will be really disastrous. So we have to get to what did this man have to say, why he had to say it, and so forth. Finally, just please give me one more second to comment. In 1843, Marx drew conclusions that were mostly about the state being to blame and the state not being changeable. And maybe that was okay, but it's not okay in 2020. Marx's further research, and I think the whole history that we've seen, indicates that the state is not at the ultimate level of the problem. It's the capitalist relations of production. So I wouldn't want us to be ending, David, where Marx ended in 1843 in response to Ruge.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Brendan, do you want to make a final comment or two?
Sure. Maybe I'll pick up a couple things that I didn't get to say in my presentation. One is that, so when I decided to take up Proudhon as an example of redistributionism, first of all, it didn't occur to me at first that I mean, I think I know Marx's critique of Proudhon very well, but it hadn't occurred to me that was an example of redistributionism, because I think of redistributionism in a very specific way because of its contemporary form, tax and welfare sort of states. And that's not what Proudhon's talking about. It was in a conversation with Andrew when he said, look, this is still an issue of redistributionism. It's just a very different appearance of the same sort of intuitions and thinking. So with that insight from Andrew, I wasn't sure what to make of it at first, but as I reread some of Marx's major critiques of Proudhon, it was sort of the lights went off in my head, and I could see it. But one of the things I was really amazed with rereading the Grundrisse is how much of the Marx's analysis of a capitalist society is happening at the same time that he's developing the concepts to counter Proudhon and Derrida. I'd always read the Grundrisse because I wasn't really paying that close of attention to its relationship to Proudhonism. I was just looking for the analysis of capitalism and the text. But if you actually stick with it as a critique of Proudhon, even though sometimes Proudhon or Derrida don't show up for 20 pages, all of a sudden he gets to a point and you realize, he mentions Proudhon, you realize the last 20 pages he's been developing like all these super important central categories of capital and central arguments you'll see later in the 3 volumes of Capital or 4 volumes of Capital. You'll see them, he's like developing all of them really rapidly and sometimes not fully developed, just to critique like a point of Proudhon's. And that made me realize like how much of this sort of opposition to this type of politics is central to everything Marx is trying to argue in Capital. It's not like he just had a critique of he just had a critique of capitalism, and then next to that he had this critique of Proudhonism. They were like all bound up with each other, and they weren't separate things. And I think that's the same here with what we're trying to do in MHI. When we have a critique of capitalism and we have a lot of critiques of the contemporary left, they're not separate issues. They're completely bound up with one another as the same critique. And I hope that people who read our stuff, listen to our stuff, can wrap their heads around that when we're talking about politics, we're not like turning off
1 minute.
We're not turning off our analysis of capitalism and then like doing a politics discussion. This is like all part of one analysis. And that's all I'll say on that point.
Okay, thank you very much, Brendan. Last panelist, any final comments from you, David?
Yeah. So first off, I'd just like to call out something I really appreciated about Andrew's presentation, which is this stress of observing that there's an emphasis on trend rather than level. That these redistributionist politicians will say, okay, well, it's been trending upwards, so therefore we need to recreate, the redistributionist policies of the New Deal and go back to the golden age of the 1950s. I found that a very important observation. They shape the questions they ask based on the answers they want. And it also made me think of another fact, which is that they always call back to the New Deal. But in fact, many of the policies that they like and would like to replicate are, in fact, Great Society policies. Social Security was created in the New Deal, but it expanded significantly under Johnson. Medicare, Medicaid were Great Society policies, but at the end of the day, Roosevelt is just more popular than Johnson. Roosevelt fought World War II, which is a popular war. Johnson started Vietnam, which is an unpopular war, so they call back to the one which is less true, but more popular. So I found that to be a very interesting theme. And on my own paper, I just mention, as I was reading through Marx's critique of Ruga and his critique of other state action to supposedly end pauperism, there were so many contemporary examples that kind of came to mind of states which have fallen back on a carceral logic, or started as charity and ended as punishment. The welfare reform of the 1990s in the United States is one example. Eric talked a bit about some of British welfare reform, contemporary British welfare. And there's just so many examples of it. And I found it very powerful the way that Marx looks at the way that this politics doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not a matter of betrayal or the political actors taking on agency necessarily, but there's kind of an objective push which can compel these sorts of actions, welfare taking on a carceral affect. And so I was very compelled by that analysis. And that's the end of my comments.
Okay, thank you very much, David. He was our last speaker there. Okay, that's all we have.
Does carceral affect means they lock people up?
Yes,
Okay.
carceral. Incarceration, yeah, it's the same word, yeah.
Okay.
All right, I had to look it up as well earlier. Okay, that's all we have time for. My thanks to our guest speakers, Andrew Kliman, Brendan Cooney, and David Matchett for all your contributions. Very interesting indeed. And thank you from me, Eric Andrian. And you were listening to part 1 of the Real Left Forum, Marxist-Humanist Initiatives Panels for the Cancelled Conference 2020. Please take a look at our website. You'll see the links below. And please check out our part 2 of our video panel entitled Marxist-Humanist Perspectives on the Life and Death Battle Against Trumpism. See you there. Thank you very much and good night.